Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we move from the parliamentary pyrotechnics at Westminster to the underlying economic conditions against which this drama will be played out. Last week, Alex asked two of the UK's most respected political commentators to forecast the moves and counter-moves of the Brexiteers and Remainers as Parliament resumed. Thus far, our pundits have proved to be spot on in their suggestions of an earthquake chain reaction to the Prime Minister's move to prorogue Parliament for much of next month.
I think if it looks as if the UK is heading for no deal, there will be an attempt for Parliament to seize control of the executive, and that attempt will succeed. The Speaker will facilitate it, and a majority will vote for it. And then there will be legislation instructing the Prime Minister to negotiate a 6-month extension. And that too will get a majority in the House of Commons if it looks as if no deal is the only other route.
I think the logic of this situation, where you have a minority Prime Minister trying to enforce his will over a Parliament which disagrees with him, the natural outcome of that would be an election.
Court challenges, street demonstrations, opposition parties forced together to seize control of the parliamentary order paper, Tory rebels, MPs crossing the floor of the House, threats of deselection, and finally, to the Prime Minister's bid for a snap election. The forecasts of our commentators were played out in this week's parliamentary exchanges.
Mr. Speaker, what he is recommending is yet more dither, yet more delay, yet more uncertainty for business. What we in this government want to do is deliver on the mandate of the people. Now, he used to be a Democrat. He used to believe in upholding the referendum result. Can he say now whether he would vote in favour of leave or remain? And can he say now whether he's in favour of a second referendum or not?
Jeremy Corbyn. The Prime Minister failed to answer my questions about food supply, about medicine supplies, and about the problems in hospitals. He refuses to publish the Yellowhammer documents, and he talks about scaremongering. Where does the information come from other than his office in his government?
This high political drama has a final chapter to come, but today we turn to the economic backdrop against which the struggle will be played out. Alex interviews Professor David Blanchflower on his view of a coming economic fury.
We've been in a decade of very slow growth, and the expectation is that we're going to see a second decade because of the utter incompetence. So go and read the great masters, go and think about how the world works. But I would say, go back and read Keynes and Beveridge.
But first, of course, your tweets, messages and emails in response to last week's show. Julian says, I'm quite sure that the will of the people is much bigger than the Brexit vote, but the people never get the chance to vote about the other stuff. Therefore, it's quite legitimate to ask if the Brexit vote was the will of the people. I don't question the results, says Julian. Louise says, the relevant question, though, is how does Scotland get out of this whole mess, bearing in mind we didn't vote for Brexit in the first place? Gordon says, a nice balance from your two guests when they recognise that Boris is most likely looking for a deal and not just guests on to slam dunk with fear-mongering. Many people thought Mrs May was too soft and the no deal taken from the table weakened her position. Mick McNamara introduces some Irish history and says, who would lead a government to succeed Johnson? Could I make a comparison? In 1948 Ireland, an election gave a majority over De Valera. Fine Gael was the biggest party, but the leader, Richard Mulcahy, was unacceptable. So he stood aside, and Johnny Costello became Taoiseach. Just giving an example. And finally from Pilar, who says, in the middle of the Brexit chaos, super interesting analysis today on the Alex Salmond Show. Excellent. Well, thank you, Pilar. Now, the Brexit debates have swallowed much of the bandwidth of British politics. There have been many forecasts on the economic consequences of varying degrees of Brexit. Some of them from the UK Treasury or Bank of England, and all of them negative. However, there has been much less discussion on how the background of the international economy feeds back into the politics of Brexit. This week, we begin a three-part series on how and why these fiscal storm clouds are gathering. We ask international economists their take on the financial environment, and we ask political economists in the UK how that background will shape the Brexit debate. Most importantly, we ask the question, what is to be done? We start this week with Alex in discussion with the international economist who can justifiably say that he forecast the full extent of the Great Recession of just over 10 years ago. For 3 years between 2006 and 2009, Professor David Blanchflower of Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, was a lone voice on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, voting for radical action on interest rates to combat a serious downturn. His latest book, Not Working, consolidates his reputation as one of the world's leading Keynesian economists. Today, he speaks to Alex about his forecast that the economic storm clouds are gathering once again, before there's even been a full recovery from the last Great Recession.
Danny Blanchflower, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, in your new book, Not Working, you argue that unemployment is as big an issue today as it was 70 years ago. How do you justify that in an age of high employment levels and apparently low unemployment levels?
Well, turns out that before 2008, the unemployment rate gave you everything you needed to know about the labour market. Unfortunately, that's not true since 2008. And the big deal now is that underemployment is what matters. People in work can't get enough hours, they can't get enough income, and that's why they're hurting. And the unemployment rate doesn't really pick that up.
Now, you say in the book that the 5 great evils identified by William Beveridge, that is want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness, they all still stalk the land. How do you justify that?
Well, I think the evidence is that unemployment rate we just talked about has been low, but around the world there's lots of despair, there's lots of helplessness, there's lots of poverty, people feeling alone, feeling as if nobody's listening to them. In America, we talk about flyover America, so the exam-taking classes and everybody else. And essentially what we've seen are the people who are hurting, the people left behind, have voted for right-wing populism. It's as if there's two worlds. There's the world of the elites and everybody else has said enough.
But despite the low wage growth over the last decade in particular, aren't people really better off because of the cost of key consumer goods is falling? You know, people have more cars, they have iPads, they have better clothes. Isn't there a real measure of affluence that the stats are missing?
Well, there's some of that, but I think job insecurity is a really big deal. But a particular, I suppose, apart from Scotland, where you were very successful in this, debt from education is a really big deal. People are struggling; they are in debt. So yes, you're right. There are iPhones and other things, but people are struggling, and we shouldn't underestimate that in the UK, real wages—that's what your pay packet can buy—today is 5% less than it was in 2008. So people are struggling. Yes, consumer goods are better than they were, but people have debts, and there's no sense in which people are feeling really good. They're not feeling really good.
Now, you argue in the book and elsewhere that there's an economic storm coming in of major proportions. Do you rely, in terms of your analysis, more on your walking about technique of speaking to people rather than in relying on inverted yield curves?
If we look back at 2008, we didn't really know that we'd gone into recession in the UK in April 08 until July 09. And what we had to do was look at the housing sector, look at consumer confidence. And that seems the right thing to do now. In the US, we saw a big drop in consumer confidence this month. The housing market's not doing terribly well. And so you have to look for timely measures to tell you where you are. And the economics of walking about seems the right thing to do. And it suggests that the global economy is slowing, manufacturers are struggling, the trade war in America is hitting farmers, although we haven't seen it come through in the data yet. And it suggests that perhaps we're at a turning point that we were in 2008. Remember that the economists and the big sets of data really didn't spot the biggest recession in a century. So we have to look at other things. And it's not really very good at the moment. The PMIs around the world, the purchasing manager indices, suggest that the global economy is really struggling. And probably the UK and Germany are already in recession.
Now, famously, 10 years ago, as a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, you were a lone voice calling for vigorous interest rate cuts to forestall what you saw as a looming recession. How did so many clever people and your colleagues miss what was happening when you were able to identify the dangers?
Well, obviously you'd have to ask them, but it seemed blindingly obvious to me by around October 2007 that the housing market in America had slowed. That economy was really slowing, and we know now it went into recession by December 2007, and the UK went in by April. So I voted for rate cuts at the end of 2007. The rest of the people on my committee probably didn't notice that for another year. I don't know, maybe they relied on economic models. They probably didn't practice the economics of walking about. I guess the benefit of being a person who looks at data, who looks at how the world actually is rather than what models say, was kind of helpful. And I think the worry is now that the same people are making the same kind of mistakes. I mean, the Fed raised rates 9 times from 2015 to 2018 based on models, no real data at all. And now we know that was a huge mistake. So I think the answer is you've got to look at what people are saying, what businesses are saying. That's what we did in 2007, and that seemed to give a good steer. And if you look at that now, it's very worrying, and the same people have missed it again.
And how well prepared are the policy makers now? I mean, have they shot most of the bolts in their locker through quantitative easing, through lower interest rates? Is there anything left to fling at an imminent recession?
Great question. I mean, the worry is that there really isn't very much ammunition. One of the big things in 2008 was we cut taxes very quickly. VAT was cut by 5%. The worry in the UK is, could Boris Johnson's government, if it had to at short notice, actually do anything? And the concern is that they probably can't. They're going to have to appoint a new governor of the Bank of England, and you would have thought they should have appointed one pretty much by now. And the question is, can they do stuff? So that's a worry. And in the United States, could actually Trump's government pass something through the Congress, through the House and the Senate? Doesn't look that likely. So I think the worry is that policymakers look to have not learnt much, and if this thing hits hard, we're going to be limited by their failure to do things to get them in a position to lessen the shock on people. So that's not a great message.
Now, how far can we identify the slow policy response to the Great Recession of 10 years ago, the inability to raise people's living standards, to identify underemployment as a serious problem? Insofar, how can we identify that as the political cause of President Trump in America, of Brexit in the United Kingdom, of the rise of right-wing populism in many countries in Europe?
Well, I mean, a great question. I mean, I think what we would look back and say, okay, once this thing hit, I mean, I remember talking to you, and you set this website up with all the shovel-ready projects that you could get out there and if you could get funding for. I mean, what happened was we got into a period of recovery where we basically threw monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, tax cuts, everything at the world. But then what happened in 2010 was that austerity was imposed, if you like. The world found Keynes for a wee while, and then they imposed austerity, which was pretty kind of disastrous and generated the slowest recovery in the UK for 300 years. So that's the background to this. And now all of a sudden what we've seen is that governments say, ha-ha, we're at full employment, and the people say, no, we're not. And how it's come through is lots of people, 0 hours contracts, people stuck not knowing how many hours a week they're going to work, stuck in a job where, yeah, maybe they have a decent pay per hour. Many of them people don't, but then they can't get enough hours. And that means that people are hurting. But governments around the world have been slow to recognize this. And here's the contradiction. The policymakers say we're at full employment, and the people say, no, we aren't. And I think that's the dilemma that we're at. But, you know, we had 10 years to sort this out, and it doesn't look like anything's been sorted out. And the people who missed the Great Recession haven't apologized for it, haven't got themselves ready for the next one, and people are going to be hurting. And in a sense, Brexit vote and Trump are all responses to that.
That's Professor David Blanchford, laying out some of the key arguments in his new book, Not Working. Join us after the break when we're going to be talking about the political economy of Brexit. Welcome back. Before the break, Professor David Blanchflower of Dartmouth College was laying out some of the key arguments in his new book, Not Working. We're going to come up to the new arguments surfacing around the economics of Brexit. Danny Blanchflower, what in your view are likely to be the economic consequences of Brexit in the short term and the medium term?
I don't think you could have picked a worse time to pick out and do Brexit. It's unclear exactly what the short and, in the end, long-term consequences of Brexit are, and separate them from the fact that there's a global trade war going on. It's the end of a 10-year-long recovery, and all of those things are happening together. Brexit itself, for the global economy, says the IMF, is a downside risk entirely to the world. So obviously these look to be major questions. It's really very hard for economists to see anything any economic benefits from this. I call it self-inflicted wounds. Maybe they're cultural. Maybe it's about sovereignty. I mean, I would say you can't eat sovereignty. So I think the answer is that a huge increase in uncertainty, no idea what trade deals are going to look like, investment slowing to a halt, and a hugely long transition period, which may well create all kinds of troubles in Ireland. And the likelihood would be, if this no-deal Brexit comes through, Scotland and perhaps even Wales will want to go and become independent. So it looks to me like self-inflicted chaos. And the question is, you know, what benefits will there be in the long run? Hard to see many. It just looks to me an economic disaster. And that's essentially what we're seeing. It looks that the UK is probably in recession now. To what extent it's just about Brexit and it's about this global trade war and so on, it's hard to separate. But it just looks like a disastrous thing to do right now.
Thinking about the G7 summit a couple of weeks ago, do you think the leaders there realised that there is an argument that many of these looming economic problems are almost entirely self-induced, that the European countries for allowing a painfully slow recovery in European economies, President Trump for his trade war practice and rhetoric, and of course Brexit as far as Boris Johnson? How much realisation among the political elite and leadership is that these economic problems can be argued to be largely self-induced?
Well, I think they can, Alex. I think that's absolutely right. And we've heard people even in Germany saying, oh, maybe what we need is some room on the fiscal front. Hearing that from Draghi, the governor of the European Central Bank, and also hearing it from Australia too. But I think there's another one you haven't actually talked about. I agree with all of those. Self-inflicted wounds, slow recovery, didn't need to impose austerity, didn't need to impose a trade war at the time when the recovery was ending. But I think there's another one, which is that the Fed raised rates 9 times. And what we know from the past is that recoveries end because the Fed makes an error. They raised rates 9 times. That clearly looks like an error. They've cut rates once. But the markets are actually saying they think in the next 6 months there's probably going to be 4 more rate cuts, reversing everything. So this looks like policy-induced error by policymakers at the central banks raising rates when they shouldn't have, bringing in Brexit at a time that was pretty bad, Trump bringing in a trade war, and then the Europeans just generating very slow recovery. Just think, say, in France, perhaps as recession comes, unemployment in France is still now close to 10%. So obviously the recovery has not been a good one. I would certainly agree with you, say, that it's been self-induced event. And in the UK, with Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, which is sitting as I do in America, it just looks utterly astonishing and inept.
And let's just say in this imaginary world that the French president had invited you, David Blanchflower, to do a quick seminar to these world leaders on how to get out of this mess. What would have been the key policy coordination that you would have advised across the key countries in the Western world?
Well, what we've got to see is, I guess the answer is you've got to put pedal to the metal and understand that global coordination has actually had a really big effect in 2009. Gordon Brown pulled the world together. Global action worked well. What we saw in the French meeting of the G7, Trump didn't want to coordinate anything. Essentially, what you need to see are countries coordinating together, getting stimulus going, trying to get economies moving again, and removing the threat of a global trade war. I mean, this is not if there's any time for it, you couldn't think of a worse time at the end of a recovery. So I'd be saying, coordinate together, think about ways of getting fiscal authorities to start reading Keynes again. Keynes warned in 1930, it's not about the crash, it's about the long dragging conditions of semi-slump. That's where we are, with the global economy set to turn down. What's the famous soccer line? Get your retaliation in first. They certainly didn't do that in 2007-8, and the suspicion is that they're not going to do it now, and that's going to be a big problem.
Danny Blanchard, you've sat in the key decision-making committees in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. What is it about economic policy making that puts such a premium on the Conservative, where people who are arguing for a cautious approach are always seen as somehow more respectable and more responsible? What is it about the pressure of decision-making that leads people into less than optimum decisions?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, I recall when I went on the committee, it turned out that I was the only person on that committee who didn't live in London and the South East and hadn't been to Oxbridge. So that in a way was the first thing, a group of people perhaps who haven't walked around, haven't been to Wakefield, haven't been to the Gorbals in Glasgow, and in America hadn't been outside the big cities. So I think there's a sort of conflict now between what goes on the streets of San Francisco, New York, and Washington than it does elsewhere. I mean, the story in a way is that there's more similarity between New York, Edinburgh and London than there is between New York and the heartland of America or in Yorkshire or in poorer parts of Scotland. So I think there's this separation of understanding, rising inequality. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I was, as you have been, sort of shocked that that these policymakers have worried about inflation and worried about we have to control inflation when basically we have non-existent inflation. Inflation was something for the 70s. Our concern now is living standards, people being essentially hurt by the economy, and the policymakers dealing with things from 40 years ago. So there is this gap, and in a sense, I think the political things of Brexit and Trump and so on are responses to that, responses to the fact that what you folks are doing doesn't help me.
I'm going to ask you two final questions, Professor Blanchflower. If you had which economic quote from any of the great economists would you advise world leaders to read before they go to bed at night?
Well, I mean, I go back, I've said this many times, the book talks about, I think actually it talks about Keynes, but especially I like Beveridge. Churchill said to Beveridge in 1943, the people are coming back from war. What's the world going to look like? And he wrote a thing called Full Employment in a Free Society. And he talked about how important employment was. And what full employment he talked about was when basically people are sitting there waiting for job offers to come in. There's a degree of security. So I think we could think about that. What happened when people came back from war to a period of full employment in contrast to the Great Depression where there was massive unemployment? And it appears we've learned nothing much from that. So I think Beveridge is pretty important. And the thing I'm very taken by, he said, unemployment surprised on the low side. Unemployment between 1950 and 1960 in the UK averaged 1.5%. We need to start to think about that, worry about getting lots of employment, decent wages, and stop wasting our time on this ridiculous nonsense about inflation, which is apparently going to take off but never does.
Professor Blanchflower, and your students in New Hampshire, is there an economic quote that you point to them and say, look, if you learn nothing else in my classes, then remember this?
Well, I think it's the 1931 quote from Keynes, where he says, it's not about the great crash, remember, not about the great financial crash, it's about what follows. It's about the long, dragging conditions of semi-slump that follow, that surprise us. And essentially, that's where we've been. We've been in a decade of very slow growth. And the expectation is that we're going to see a second decade because of the utter incompetence. So go and read the great masters, go and think about how the world works. But I would say, go back and read Keynes and Beveridge.
Professor David Blanchflower, thank you so much for joining us on the Alex Salmond Show.
Alex, always a pleasure. Great talking to you again.
There is a reason why the Brexit drama has diverted attention from many other areas of politics. 2 prime ministers have already fallen on Brexit, and the latest one could follow them. Huge headlines have followed the various personalities in the play, even those whose role is as merely supporting members of the cast. Some who are coming, like Downing Street spinmeister-in-chief Dominic Cummings, and those now leaving the stage, like former Scottish Tory leader Ruth Davidson. Insofar as the economy has been debated at all, it has been in terms of the economic consequences of Brexit to one degree or another. For the UK, these range from medium-term catastrophic to short-term turbulence, to cite the Cabinet Brexit Supremo's own favoured description. However, although crucial for the UK and for Ireland, the economic consequences of Brexit are but one small factor impacting on the world economy at present. It is far more likely that the direction on the world economy will dictate the outcome, or at least the timing, of Brexit, rather than vice versa. For example, if Downing Street believed that the world economy is heading south at a rapid rate of knots, then a very early election becomes fundamentally more politically attractive than one next year, when Brexit's short-term turbulence is set against the backdrop of a general economic downturn. Is that the unspoken reason for the Prime Minister's back me or face the ballot box ultimatum to his rebels this week? Professor David Blanchflower calls for a root and branch assault on underemployment in the economy, and indeed a recognition that the slow recovery of the last few years is the genesis of the politics of Brexit in the UK, Trump in the USA, and the rise of right-wing populism across the liberal democracies. In other words, to understand the underlying politics and the timing of Brexit, it is a question of, it's the economy, stupid. Over the next 2 weeks, we will explore these themes with economists internationally and political economists domestically. We asked Professor Carles Boix of Princeton University whether governments around the world now have the financial firepower to effectively combat recession. And we asked former MP George Kerevan which type of policies could arrest the march of right-wing populism. But until then, from Alex and me and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.